My son sold my $5.5 million Malibu beach house while I was unconscious during open-heart surgery. He thought my signature on the papers was perfect. He didn't know he'd only sold the building a worthless shell. He didn't know I still owned the land it was sitting on. When I found out, I said nothing. I just waited for the housewarming party for his new mansion, the one he bought with my money. I waited until he raised his glass for a toast. Then the police arrived to give him my real gift. The first thing I remember is the light. A sterile, unforgiving white light that buzzed somewhere above me. It wasn't the warm, gentle light of the California sun I was used to, the kind that filtered through the large glass windows of my home and danced on the Pacific Ocean. This was a cold, clinical light. Then came the sound, a steady rhythmic beeping that seemed to count out the seconds of my life. I tried to lift my head, but a dull, heavy ache in my chest pinned me down. My memories were a fog, a series of disconnected images, a sharp pain in my arm, the wail of a siren getting closer. A panicked face, my son Julian's, hovering over me. A doctor with kind eyes and a weary face leaned into my field of vision. He explained that I had suffered a major heart attack. I had undergone emergency bypass surgery. The words floated around me, but they didn't quite stick. I was alive, but I felt like a spectator in my own body. Julian and his wife Brenda were there, their faces masks of practiced concern. Brenda squeezed my hand a little too tightly, her rings digging into my skin. Julian kept smoothing my blanket, his movements jerky and anxious. "Dad, you gave us such a scare," Julian said, his voice a little too loud for the quiet room. "But don't you worry about a thing. Everything has been taken care of." That sentence, meant to be reassuring, sent a small, cold signal to a part of my brain that was still functioning clearly. I am, or rather was, a forensic accountant. I spent 40 years of my life sifting through numbers looking for the lie hidden in a ledger, the story that the figures didn't want to tell. My wife Clara, who I missed every single day, used to be a paralegal. She had a saying she repeated like a prayer. "Elias, look at what people do, not what they say. The truth is never in the words. It's in the actions." Julian's action was one of over-the-top reassurance. Brenda's was an endless stream of chatter about how they were going to simplify my life, now how I wouldn't have to worry about the big house anymore. They were words of comfort, but their actions felt like they were clearing a path, preparing for something I wasn't a part of. I closed my eyes, feigning exhaustion, but behind my eyelids my mind was already starting to open the books on them. A week later, they drove me home. Home. The word felt different. It was my house, the one Clara and I had designed together, a monument of cedar and glass perched on the cliffs of Malibu. Every corner held a memory. Every window framed a view we had chosen together. As I stepped out of the car, the familiar scent of salt and sagebrush filled the air, but inside something was off. It was clean, too clean. The comfortable clutter of my life had been organized into sterile tidiness. A few of Clara's favorite little sculptures were missing from the mantelpiece, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible smell of fresh paint in the hallway. Brenda chattered on about how they'd had the place professionally cleaned as a welcome home gift. Julian was unusually quiet, busy with his phone. As he rushed to get my bags from the trunk, a single sheet of paper slipped from his leather briefcase and drifted onto the driveway. He didn't notice. I bent down slowly, my chest aching with the effort, and picked it up. It was a printed email. The subject line read, "Final Appraisal, 1217 Pacific Coast Highway." My address. My eyes scanned the body of the email. It was from a high-end real estate appraisal firm. The number at the bottom of the page made the air leave my lungs. $5,500,000. My mind raced. Why would Julian need a formal appraisal of my home? I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, and said nothing. My silence was a wall he couldn't see, but I was building it brick by brick. That night, sleep was impossible. The rhythmic crash of the waves outside, a sound that had soothed me for decades, now sounded like a ticking clock. I slipped out of bed and went to my office. The house was dark and silent. I sat down at my desk, the glow of the computer screen illuminating my face. With trembling fingers, I typed my own address into Zillow, then Redfin, my heart pounding against my newly repaired ribs. There it was, a picture of my home professionally photographed, glowing under a perfect sunset. And next to the picture, a single brutal word, in bold red letters, old. Below it, the date of the sale. 3 days after my heart attack. The day I was lying unconscious on an operating table. The rage I expected didn't come. There was no fire, no desire to scream. Instead, a glacial calm settled over me. It was the same feeling I used to get right before I untangled a complex web of financial fraud. The anger was there, but it was a cold, focused energy. My son had sold my home from under me while I fought for my life. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated act of betrayal. And as a forensic accountant, I knew one thing above all else: you don't make a move until you have all the evidence. My first step was to confirm the unthinkable. I knew that property records in Los Angeles County were public information. It was my field of expertise. I navigated the county registrar's website, a system I knew as well as my own backyard. I typed in the parcel number for my property, a string of digits I knew by heart. The screen loaded, and the documents appeared. There it was in black and white, an official notarized deed of transfer. My eyes scanned the document. The buyer was a corporation I'd never heard of, a numbered LLC, a common way to obscure the identity of a wealthy buyer. My gaze moved to the seller's signature line. It was my name, Elias Vance, written in a shaky, uncertain hand. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. He hadn't even gotten the loop on the E right. It was the signature of someone trying to imitate an old man's hand, someone who thought I was too weak, too frail, too close to death to ever notice. They had used a power of attorney document likely signed when I was being wheeled into surgery, a standard form I wouldn't have even questioned. They had used my moment of ultimate vulnerability to strip me of everything I had ever worked for, everything Clara and I had built. The signature wasn't just a forgery. It was an act of profound contempt. It was Julian's way of saying, "You are already gone." He was wrong. The betrayal was complete, but my investigation had just begun. He had closed a chapter. I was about to open a case. My hand was steady as I picked up the phone. I didn't call Julian. A direct confrontation was for amateurs, for people ruled by emotion. I was a man ruled by numbers and process. There was only one person I could call. The number was memorized, a relic from a past life that had suddenly become my present. It rang twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered. "Sterling?" "David," I said, my voice even. "It's Elias." There was a pause and then the warmth of a 40-year friendship. "Elias, it's good to hear your voice. I heard about the surgery. How are you holding up?" "The doctors say I'm fine," I replied, cutting through the pleasantries. "But I have a situation here. A professional one." David's tone shifted instantly, the warmth replaced by the sharp focus of the FBI agent he used to be. "Go ahead." I laid it out for him, not as a heartbroken father, but as if I were presenting a case file. I told him about the hospital, the suspicious words, the appraisal, the online property record, and the forged signature. I was concise, factual, and devoid of emotion. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Elias," David said finally, his voice grim. "This is big, bigger than you think. This isn't just a family dispute. We're talking about multiple federal offenses. Wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, elder fraud. The list is long. The fact that you were medically incapacitated makes it a slam dunk for the prosecutor." "I know," I said. "What's my next move?" "Your next move is to do absolutely nothing," David commanded. "Do not speak to Julian. Do not speak to Brenda. You are now a victim in an active investigation, even if it's one only you and I know about right now. Your house is a crime scene. You need to act like the same frail old man they think you are. Do you understand? I understand. Good, David said. Now we need to build our own file, a clean one completely separate from what they did. I need you to get your bank statements going back 6 months. I need any and all correspondence with Julian and Brenda. Most importantly, I need you to find every single original document you have related to that house. The deed, the mortgage papers, the blueprints, anything your wife Clara might have kept. You cannot let Julian know you're looking for these things. He sold your house, Elias. You are in his mind a guest there now. He's just letting you stay out of the goodness of his heart until he decides where to put you. The words were harsh, but David was right. He was framing the narrative, forcing me to see the cold, hard reality of the situation. Through our conversation, memories surfaced of the cases we had worked on together years ago. I was the one who could find a single misplaced decimal point in a sea of data that could bring down a corporation. David was the one who could take that single data point and build an ironclad case around it. We were a good team. My skills hadn't vanished. They had just been dormant. David's instructions were clear. The game was afoot, and I knew exactly how to play my part. I was no longer just Elias Vance, the grieving widower. I was Elias Vance, the forensic accountant, and my son's life was now an open ledger waiting to be audited. After my call with David, I knew where I had to look. Clara was meticulous, a record keeper of the highest order. While I saw the world in numbers, she saw it in paper trails, in clauses and subclauses. She always said, the fine print is where the truth lives. In my office, behind a row of dull accounting textbooks, was a small fireproof safe. Julian didn't know it existed. I spun the combination, the familiar clicks echoing in the silent house. Inside, past old stock certificates, and my passport, was a heavy dark green metal box. It wasn't locked. Clara didn't believe in putting a lock on top of a lock. Her security was in the complexity of the contents. On top of the box was a single yellowed label with her elegant handwriting, Vance Family Trust. I lifted the lid. Inside, organized with perfect precision, was a stack of documents bound in legal blue covers. It was the entire history of our home, from the first survey of the raw land to the final construction permits. But underneath it all was a much thicker document. The title page read, The Vance Family Irrevocable Trust Agreement, and I spent the next 2 hours reading, and with every page a sense of awe washed over me. What Clara had done all those years ago was an act of pure legal genius. I picked up the phone and dialed a number in New York City. A sharp, professional voice answered on the first ring. Alicia Reed. Alicia, I said. It's your Uncle Elias. Uncle Elias? Her voice immediately warmed. Alicia was Clara's niece, a brilliant corporate lawyer who had inherited all of her aunt's intelligence and tenacity. I heard about your surgery. Are you all right? I'm recovering, I said, my voice steady. But I need you to fly out to California, immediately. It's about your Aunt Clara's trust. The urgency in my tone cut through the line. There was no hesitation. I'll be on the first flight in the morning. True to her word, Alicia arrived the next afternoon. She sat in my living room, the Pacific Ocean glittering behind her, and laid the documents from the green box across the coffee table. She read in silence, her eyes scanning the pages with an intensity that reminded me so much of Clara. She cross-referenced documents, made notes in the margins, and occasionally let out a low whistle of admiration. After nearly 3 hours, she finally looked up from the papers. Her face was a mixture of professional respect and sheer disbelief. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. Uncle Elias, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Aunt Clara was a fortress. Julian didn't sell your house. She paused for dramatic effect, a little trick she probably used in the courtroom. That idiot only sold the building. I stared at her, not quite understanding. Alicia picked up 2 separate documents. This is where the magic is, she explained, her energy rising with excitement. When you and Aunt Clara bought this land 30 years ago, She structured the deal in a way that I have only seen in complex commercial real estate transactions, never for a private home. It's brilliant. First, she created the Vance Family Irrevocable Trust. The trust, and only the trust, owns the land itself. The multi-million-dollar cliffside plot we are sitting on right now belongs to the trust. She pointed to the second document. This is the deed for the physical house. The wood, the glass, the foundation. The structure itself is legally a separate entity, and it was owned by you. What Julian forged your signature on was the deed to the house, the building. He had no legal authority to touch the trust, so he couldn't sell the land. It started to sink in, a slow, dawning realization of my wife's incredible foresight. But the buyer paid $5.5 million, I said, thinking aloud. They wouldn't do that just for the structure. Alicia smiled a predator's smile. Exactly, because no one in their right mind would. Which brings us to the masterstroke. She held up a third document, a much thinner one. This is a 99-year ground lease. The structure owned by you was legally leasing the land from the trust for $1 a year. The lease contains a standard but crucial clause that any transfer of ownership of the structure must be approved by the trust's board, which is me and you. Since that didn't happen the moment Julian's fraudulent sale went through, he automatically voided the lease. She let the implications hang in the air. So what does this mean? I asked. Alicia leaned back, the sunlight catching the triumphant glint in her eye. It means that a very wealthy man, this Mr. Harrison, has just paid $5.5 million for a building that he has absolutely no legal right to keep on our land. After my call with David, I knew where I had to look. Clara was meticulous, a record keeper of the highest order. While I saw the world in numbers, she saw it in paper trails, in clauses and subclauses. She always said the fine print is where the truth lives. In my office, behind a row of dull accounting textbooks, was a small fireproof safe. Julian didn't know it existed. I spun the combination, the familiar clicks echoing in the silent house. Inside, past old stock certificates, and my passport was a heavy dark green metal box. It wasn't locked. Clara didn't believe in putting a lock on top of a lock. Her security was in the complexity of the contents. On top of the box was a single yellowed label with her elegant handwriting, Vance Family Trust. I lifted the lid. Inside, organized with perfect precision, was a stack of documents bound in legal blue covers. It was the entire history of our home, from the first survey of the raw land to the final construction permits. But underneath it all was a much thicker document. The title page read, The Vance Family Irrevocable Trust Agreement. I spent the next 2 hours reading, and with every page a sense of awe washed over me. What Clara had done all those years ago was an act of pure legal genius. I picked up the phone and dialed a number in New York City. A sharp professional voice answered on the first ring. Alicia Reed. Alicia, I said. It's your Uncle Elias. Uncle Elias. Her voice immediately warmed. Alicia was Clara's niece, a brilliant corporate lawyer who had inherited all of her aunt's intelligence and tenacity. I heard about your surgery. Are you all right? I'm recovering, I said, my voice steady. But I need you to fly out to California, immediately. It's about your Aunt Clara's trust. The urgency in my tone cut through the line. There was no hesitation. I'll be on the first flight in the morning. True to her word, Alicia arrived the next afternoon. She walked into my living room, not with the sympathy of a relative, but with the focused energy of a litigator stepping into a courtroom. She was all business, her dark hair pulled back neatly, a leather satchel full of legal pads and pens in her hand. We exchanged brief pleasantries, but she could see in my eyes that this was not a social call. I simply pointed to the green metal box which I had placed in the center of our large oak coffee table. That's everything, I said. Everything Clara kept. Alicia nodded, taking off her blazer and draping it over a chair. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds in the room were the rustle of old paper, the scratch of her pen on a legal pad, and the distant crash of the waves on the shore below. She worked with a methodical grace that was pure Clara. She carefully laid out each document in chronological order, creating a timeline of our life together, told through deeds, permits, and contracts. She read with an unblinking intensity, her brow occasionally furrowing in concentration, her lips moving silently as she absorbed complex legal jargon. I sat in my armchair, watching her. In her focus, I saw my wife so clearly it ached. I remembered Clara sitting at this very table late at night, long after I had gone to bed, surrounded by these same papers. I was the numbers man, the one who made the money. But she was the protector, the one who built the walls to keep our world safe. I had always thought she was just being overly cautious, a bit of a pessimist. I saw now that she wasn't pessimistic. She was a strategist. She was playing a long game of chess against a future she somehow anticipated, a future where the biggest threat to our family might come from within. About 2 hours into her review, Alicia suddenly stopped. She was holding the thick trust agreement in one hand and the original land deed in the other. She read a passage from the trust, then glanced at the deed, then back to the trust. A low whistle escaped her lips. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated admiration. She took a deep breath and continued reading, but now a small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. She had found something. She had seen the outlines of the fortress Clara had built. When she was finally done, she neatly stacked all the papers back into their respective folders. She took off her reading glasses, cleaned them deliberately, and then looked at me. Her professional demeanor had been replaced by something else, something fierce and protective. "Uncle Elias," she began, her voice quiet but ringing with clarity. "I've handled hostile takeovers for billion-dollar companies. I've seen some of the most complex legal maneuvering you can imagine. But I have to say, your wife, my Aunt Clara, was an absolute genius." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. Alicia picked up the forged deed of sale that I had printed from the county website and held it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of trash. "Julian thinks he sold this house," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "He thinks he pulled off the perfect crime, selling your most valuable asset while you were helpless." She then pointed to the mountain of carefully organized documents on the table. "What he doesn't know is that Aunt Clara made sure that the house was never the most valuable asset." She let the statement hang in the air, the waves crashing outside providing a dramatic underscore. "Julian didn't sell your house," she said, her eyes locking onto mine, a triumphant fire burning within them. "That idiot only sold the building." I stared at her, the words hanging in the air, refusing to make sense. "Only the building, Alicia. What are you talking about? The man paid $5.5 million. That's the value of the house and the land combined." Alicia's smile was thin and sharp, the kind that won court cases. "Exactly," she said. "He paid for a $5.5 million view, but he only bought the window. Allow me to explain the masterpiece your wife created." She stood up and began to pace in front of the large window, using the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean as her backdrop. She picked up the thickest document from the coffee table, the trust agreement. "Exhibit A," she said, holding it up. "The Vance Family Irrevocable Trust. When you and Aunt Clara bought this property, you didn't just buy a piece of land. She structured the purchase. The trust, a completely separate legal entity, is what actually purchased the land itself. This cliff, this beach access, the ground, everything sits on, valued at roughly $4 million, is owned by the trust. Not you. According to this document, you are the lifetime beneficiary. That gives you the undeniable right to live here, to enjoy it, until your last day. But you do not have the power to sell it. It's an ironclad box, Uncle Elias. Clara designed it to protect the core asset from anything and everything, be it creditors, lawsuits, or..." She paused, letting the word land. "Family." My mind, accustomed to the clean logic of numbers, was racing to catch up with the legal brilliance. Alicia then picked up a second, much simpler document, the deed to the house. "Exhibit B," she continued. "This is the deed to the physical structure. The wood, the glass, the foundation. The building itself valued at about $1.5 million. This and only this was legally in your name. This is the document Julian forged your signature on. He sold the house, yes. But a house is just an object. Without the land underneath it, it's a very large, very expensive paperweight. I finally understood. A slow wave of comprehension so profound, it was almost dizzying, washed over me. I looked around the room at the high cedar ceilings and the stone fireplace, and for the first time I saw them as separate from the earth they were bolted to. "But how can that be legal?" I asked. "How can you own a house on land you don't own?" Alicia beamed, clearly impressed by her aunt's genius. "That, Uncle Elias, is the final beautiful piece of the puzzle. Exhibit C." She held up a single crisp piece of paper. "The ground lease. Aunt Clara had the trust lease the land to you, the owner of the building, for a term of 99 years for the price of $1 a year. It's a legal mechanism often used for skyscrapers in Manhattan, not beach houses in Malibu. It was an act of pure foresight." She walked over and placed the document in my hands. Her finger pointed to a specific paragraph, Clause 7b. "And here is the kill shot," she said. "The lease explicitly states that any unauthorized sale or transfer of the structure's ownership immediately voids the lease agreement. The moment Julian's fraudulent sale was registered with the county, he didn't just sell your house, he triggered a legal time bomb." She let me absorb the information, then she delivered the final, devastating summary. "So, to put it all together," Alicia said, her voice calm and lethal, "your son Julian forged your signature to sell a $1.5 million building. The buyer, this Mr. Harrison, was foolish enough to pay $5.5 million for it, thinking he was getting the land too. But what he actually bought was a building that, as of this moment, is illegally trespassing on the $4 million property of the Vance Family Trust. He didn't just get a bad deal, Uncle Elias. He bought a multi-million-dollar problem that he is now legally required to remove from our land." With the full scope of Clara's plan revealed, the grief in my heart was joined by a new, powerful feeling resolve. Alicia transformed my quiet home office into a war room. The warmth and memories were still there, but now they were overlaid with a cold, strategic purpose. She sat at my desk, the one Clara had used for so many years, and began to draft the first official communication. It was a letter, but in the world of law, a letter like this is a declaration of war. It was addressed to Mr. James Harrison, the new unwitting owner of a very expensive problem. I watched over her shoulder as she typed. The language was not emotional or accusatory. It was precise, clinical, and absolutely lethal. Each sentence was a carefully crafted blow. The letter informed Mr. Harrison that his recent acquisition of the property at 1217 Pacific Coast Highway was the result of a fraudulent conveyance. It detailed that the seller's signature was a forgery executed while the legal owner, myself, was medically incapacitated and unconscious. It went on to explain, with referenced attachments of the relevant trust and lease documents, the legal separation of the structure and the land. And then came the final paragraph, the one that would turn Mr. Harrison's dream investment into a nightmare. It stated that due to the unauthorized transfer of ownership, the ground lease for the structure was now null and void. As the land was the legal property of the Vance Family Trust, Mr. Harrison's building was now considered a trespassing structure. The letter concluded by formally serving him a 60-day notice to quit, requiring him to remove the entire multi-million-dollar building from the trust's property. The letter was printed on heavy cream-colored legal stationery. It was sent via certified mail with a return receipt requested. The first move had been made. The response came 4 days later, not in writing, but in the form of a phone call to Alicia from a lawyer with a slick, condescending voice. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison's legal counsel. I listened on speakerphone as he laughed dismissively. "Ms. Reed," he began. "My client, Mr. Harrison, has passed along your creative piece of correspondence. Let me be blunt. We see this for what it is, a pathetic attempt at extortion. A shakedown. You and your senile client seem to think you can squeeze a few extra dollars out of a man of Mr. Harrison's stature. It's not going to happen." Alicia was silent for a moment, letting his arrogance hang in the air. When she finally spoke, her voice was as calm and cold as a frozen lake. "Counselor," she said, "I suggest you advise your client to read the documents we provided more carefully. This is not a negotiation. It's a notification. Your client has 56 days remaining to remove his trespassing property. After that, the Vance Trust will begin filing for damages. And as for my client's state of mind, we have medical records and a sworn affidavit from his cardiac surgeon. The only party committing extortion here is your client, who is currently in possession of an asset purchased through felonious means. Have a good day." She hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. Mr. Harrison, like my son, had made the fatal mistake of underestimating us. While Alicia handled the civil front, I worked with David Sterling on the criminal one. This was my territory. David, using his old contacts, helped Alicia secure a subpoena for Julian's bank records. When the statements arrived, I felt a familiar thrill, the cold excitement of a hunter finding the tracks. I spread the pages across my dining room table, and there it was. A single wire transfer dated the day of my surgery. $5,500,000 deposited into a new account under Julian's name. He had tried to be clever, moving the money around between different accounts afterward, but the initial deposit was the smoking gun. I traced every dollar, creating a flowchart that showed a large portion going to pay off debts, another chunk going towards the down payment on a new mansion in Beverly Hills, and a significant amount transferred to Brenda's personal accounts. It was a clear and obvious roadmap of their crime. We began to assemble our file for the district attorney. It was a work of art, a perfect and undeniable narrative of greed and betrayal. The first section contained high-resolution side-by-side comparisons of my real signature and the forgery on the deed. The second section was the financial evidence, my meticulously prepared charts showing the flow of money from the fraudulent sale. The third section was medical. It included a detailed sworn affidavit from my surgeon, Dr. Evans, outlining my critical condition and stating that I was unconscious and incapable of making any legal decisions at the time the documents were signed. The final section was David's contribution, a concise summary of the applicable state and federal laws that had been broken, complete with the potential prison sentences for each charge. When the file was complete, it was over 100 pages long. Alicia bound it in a professional blue cover. It was no longer just a collection of papers. It was a weapon. I watched her walk out of my house, the file tucked securely under her arm, on her way to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's office. There was no turning back now. The quiet, methodical work was done. The gears of a much larger, more powerful machine were beginning to turn, and they were turning slowly but surely right towards my son. A few weeks passed in a strange, tense quiet. I played the part of the recovering patient, speaking to Julian in short, simple phone calls. I never asked about the house. I never asked about the money. I gave him no reason to suspect that I was anything other than the frail, forgetful old man he believed me to be. I knew he and Brenda were busy spending their newfound fortune, and I was content to let them build their gilded cage bar by shiny, expensive bar. The silence was my greatest weapon. In the absence of questions, they filled the void with their own self-congratulations. Then the inevitable call came. I was sitting on my porch watching the pelicans dive into the waves when my phone rang with Julian's picture on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a slow breath and consciously making my voice sound a little weaker, a little more tired than I actually felt. "Hello, Julian." "Dad. How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice booming with an artificial energy. He didn't wait for an answer. "Listen, I have the most incredible news. Brenda and we closed a huge deal, a real game changer. I can't go into the details, business is business, but let's just say all my hard work has finally paid off in a big way. I could almost hear the smug grin on his face. I pictured him pacing around a large, empty room, his voice echoing slightly, the sound of a man trying to convince himself of his own greatness. That's wonderful, son," I said, putting a slight quaver in my voice. "It's more than wonderful, Dad. It's monumental," he continued. "We bought a new place, an estate in Beverly Hills. It has a screening room, an infinity pool, the whole 9 yards. It's a real statement. It's what success looks like." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He was describing his new house bought with the proceeds of selling mine. "It sounds very impressive," I managed to say. "You have to see it," he insisted, "which is why I'm calling. Brenda and I are throwing a little housewarming party in 2 weeks, a Saturday night. Just a few close friends and business associates. We want you to be there. As the guest of honor, of course." The guest of honor. He wanted to parade me around as the doting father, the patriarch of the successful family he had created. He wanted to use me as a prop in his theater of lies. The audacity was breathtaking. This wasn't just an invitation. It was the final arrogant act of a man who believed he had gotten away with everything. "I don't know, Julian," I said, letting my voice trail off. "I'm still not feeling very strong." "Nonsense, Dad," he said quickly. "The fresh air will do you good. It's time for you to see what I've accomplished. You'll be so proud." This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. This was the opening they had given me. "All right, son," I said, my voice soft, almost a whisper. "If it's that important to you, I'll be there." I paused, letting him savor his victory, before I added the final perfect touch. "I'll be there to celebrate your accomplishment." "Fantastic, Dad, I knew you'd come around. I'll send a car for you. See you then." He hung up, no doubt feeling triumphant. I ended the call and immediately dialed a different number, creating a 3-way conference call with Alicia and David. I relayed the conversation word for word. When I finished, there was a moment of silence on the line. It was David who spoke first, his voice low and serious. "It's a gift," he said. "He just handed us the perfect stage for the final act, a public setting surrounded by his so-called friends and colleagues. It's clean, it's contained, and it sends the strongest possible message. It's better than we could have planned." Alicia's voice was sharp and focused. "I agree. I'll notify the DA's office immediately. They have the warrants ready. We just needed the right time and place. A housewarming party for a house he bought with stolen money. The optics are devastating. The arrest will be the centerpiece of the evening." And we finalized the details. The district attorney's office would have plainclothes detectives on standby just a few blocks away. David would be the one to enter the party first to give the signal. My role was simple: show up, act my part, and be the quiet eye of the hurricane. The trap was no longer just a plan on paper. It now had a date, a time, and a location. In 2 weeks, I would attend a party to celebrate my son's success, knowing that by the end of the night, his entire world would be reduced to ashes. The invitation had been offered, and I had accepted. The days leading up to the party were the strangest of my life. I existed in a state of profound and unsettling tranquility. The gears of justice were turning. The trap was set, and all that was left for me to do was wait. I spent my time in quiet rituals, walking the familiar paths of my life, as if to memorize them one last time, even though I was fighting to keep them. Each morning I would walk down the wooden steps from my deck to the beach. The sand was cool under my bare feet, and the rhythmic sigh of the waves washing ashore was a constant, steadying presence. This had been my routine with Clara for over 30 years. It was our church, our sanctuary. On the Thursday before the party, 2 days before the storm was set to break, I saw them. A pristine white truck with the logo Harrison Luxury Developments was parked where my son's car used to be. 2 men in crisp polo shirts were on my lawn, the one Clara had spent years cultivating with seagrass and native flowers. They had a surveyor's tripod set up and were unrolling a long measuring tape across the grass. A third man, presumably the foreman, was holding a tablet pointing toward the house and then toward the cliff edge. I stopped at the bottom of my steps, partially hidden by the wooden supports. I didn't move. I just watched. They were planning. They were measuring. They were so confident in their ownership, so certain of their right to be there, that they didn't even notice the old man watching them from the shadows. I could hear snippets of their conversation carried on the ocean breeze. Words like infinity edge, fire pit, and demolition of the old deck. They were discussing how they would erase every trace of the life Clara and I had built, replacing it with a monument to a rich man's ego. Another man might have stormed up the beach shouting, waving his arms, telling them to get off his property. But I felt nothing of the sort. My anger had been forged into something harder, colder, and far more patient. I watched them measure the ground, where I had taught Julian to throw a baseball, the spot where Clara and I had hosted countless summer barbecues with our friends. I watched them point to her rose garden, the one she had babied for decades, and talk about where the new hot tub would go. And I remained silent. My silence felt vast and powerful, like the deep ocean just beyond the breakers. They saw a quiet beach, an empty house. They couldn't see the legal tsunami that was gathering force just over the horizon, a wave that was about to crash down and sweep all their little plans and measurements away. They were measuring for a swimming pool, but they couldn't measure the depth of the deception that had brought them here. They were planning a foundation, but they were standing on ground that was about to give way beneath their feet. I stood there for nearly half an hour, a quiet ghost observing the desecration of his own life. The foreman eventually saw me. He gave a brief dismissive nod, the kind you give to a neighbor or a groundskeeper. He saw an old man, nothing more. I gave a slow, deliberate nod in return. Let him think what he wanted. Let them all think they had won. Storms don't announce their arrival with thunder. They begin with a subtle shift in the air, a stillness that feels wrong. That stillness was me. As I turned and walked back up the steps, I knew that this was the last quiet morning. The next time I saw this beach, the world would be a very different place for my son and for the man who thought he now owned my home. The calm was almost over. The car Julian sent was a black silent limousine that felt more like a hearse than a mode of transportation. As we glided through the winding manicured streets of Beverly Hills, I felt like a ghost being ferried to his own funeral. We pulled up to a house that wasn't a home but a monument to money. It was a stark white cube of glass and concrete perched on a hillside glowing with an aggressive cold light. The thumping bass of the music vibrated through the floor of the car before we even came to a stop. This was the stage my son had built with the proceeds of his betrayal. I had chosen my costume for the evening with care. An old navy blue suit, the one I had worn to my own retirement party a decade ago. It was well made but hopelessly out of fashion, the fabric softened with age. It made me look exactly as they saw me, a relic, a man from a bygone era, someone to be pitied and managed. The driver, a young man in a crisp uniform, helped me out of the car. I leaned heavily on my cane, a prop I didn't truly need, and took a moment to steady myself. Every step I took was a conscious act of theater. I walked into a wall of noise and perfume. The house was overflowing with people who all looked vaguely the same, sleek-tanned and dressed in expensive, minimalist clothing. They held glasses of champagne and laughed with their teeth, their eyes constantly scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. Waiters in black moved silently through the crowd with trays of elaborate, tiny food. It was a perfectly curated image of success, and it felt as hollow as a drum. I saw them across the room near the massive floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the glittering carpet of Los Angeles. Brenda was draped in a silver dress that shimmered under the recessed lighting, a diamond necklace sparkling at her throat. She was laughing, a high, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. Julian stood beside her, one hand holding a champagne flute, the other gesturing expansively as he spoke to a small, captivated audience. He was in his element, the king in his new castle. I heard snippets of his conversation as I slowly made my way through the crowd, an invisible old man in a sea of ambition. "It's all about identifying undervalued assets," he was saying, his voice full of false modesty. "You have to be aggressive, willing to disrupt the market. My father, he was old school, believed in waiting. I believe in making things happen." The irony was so bitter it almost made me smile. The undervalued asset was me. The disruption was grand larceny. He finally spotted me. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance perhaps at this reminder of a past he was trying so desperately to bury under layers of concrete and cash. But the look was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a wide, performative smile. "Dad!" he exclaimed loud enough for everyone to hear. He strode over and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. It wasn't an embrace. It was an act of possession. "Everyone!" Julian announced, his voice projecting across the room. "I'd like you all to meet the man who made this all possible. My father, Elias Vance." A polite, scattered applause rippled through the room. People turned to look at me, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and pity. I was the quaint, antique backstory to their host's modern success story. "My dad taught me everything I know." Julian lied, his arm squeezing my shoulder. "He taught me the value of hard work, of integrity. He built his world with his two hands, and he inspired me to build mine. He was using me as a shield, as a way to legitimize his stolen wealth. He was painting a masterpiece of hypocrisy, and I was the canvas." I played my part, offering a weak, slightly confused smile. I nodded slowly, as if I were touched by his words, as if I didn't see the lie in his eyes. He led me through the party, introducing me to his new friends. A tech billionaire, a movie producer, a famous real estate agent. To each of them, he told the same story, a fantasy, where he was the loyal son who had built upon his father's humble legacy. And with each telling, I could feel the trap closing. Every word he spoke was another bar on his own cage. Every lie was another nail in his coffin. Inside, I was a silent observer, a forensic accountant taking meticulous notes. I saw the greed in their eyes. I saw the desperate need for validation in my sons. I saw a room full of people who had mistaken money for worth and success for character. They were all living in a beautiful, fragile house of cards, and I was holding the one card that could bring it all down. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment. And I knew, as Julian tapped a glass to call for everyone's attention, that the moment was very, very close. The room fell into a reverent hush as Julian tapped a crystal champagne flute with his spoon. He stood in the center of the vast living room, a triumphant smile plastered on his face, Brenda beaming at his side. He raised his glass, the very picture of a man who believed he had conquered the world. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth and confident, "thank you all for coming to celebrate with us. They say that success is a journey, not a destination. But tonight," he paused, letting out a self-satisfied chuckle, "tonight feels pretty damn good as a destination." The crowd laughed along with him. Brenda and I wanted to share this moment with all of you, the people who have been with us on this incredible ride. This house is more than just a house. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of vision, of risk-taking, and of knowing when to make a bold move. He then turned his gaze toward me, standing quietly near a large potted fig tree. He motioned for me to come forward, but I simply shook my head, giving him a small, weak smile. He took that as his cue. "And I want to make a special toast," he continued, his voice thick with false sentiment, "to my father Elias. He's a man from a different time, a time of caution and slow, steady work. He may not always understand the speed of the modern world, but he laid the foundation of integrity that I've built my entire career on. So, to my father, and to the future." As the crowd raised their glasses and echoed, "To the future," The grand 10-foot-tall front doors of the mansion swung silently open. The sudden influx of cool night air made the candles on the tables flicker. All conversation stopped. Standing in the doorway, framed by the darkness outside, was my friend David Sterling. He wasn't in uniform, but he wore a dark suit and an expression of such solemn authority that it instantly commanded the attention of every person in the room. Flanking him were two other individuals, a man and a woman, their expressions equally grim, their jackets doing a poor job of concealing the badges clipped to their belts. The music, which had been a low thumping rhythm, seemed to fade into nothingness. The silence that fell over the party was absolute. David's eyes scanned the room, bypassing everyone until they landed on my son. "Julian Vance," David asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. Julian lowered his champagne glass, his smile faltering. A look of confusion, then irritation crossed his face. "Yes, I'm sorry. Can I help you?" "This is a private party." David took 3 slow steps into the room, the detectives following close behind. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My name is David Sterling. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said calmly. "I have a warrant for your arrest, and for the arrest of your wife, Brenda Vance." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Brenda's hand flew to her diamond necklace, her perfectly made-up face turning a sickly shade of pale. Julian stared, his mouth slightly agape. "Arrest? You've got to be kidding me. There's been a mistake. A huge mistake." He tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat. David showed no emotion. He simply took another step forward. "There is no mistake, Mr. Vance," he said. The detectives moved with a quiet efficiency, one toward Julian, the other toward Brenda. "You are being placed under arrest for the following charges: felony forgery violation of California Penal Code 368, felony financial elder fraud, and federal wire fraud." Brenda let out a small, strangled sob as the female detective reached her side. Julian's face had crumpled, the mask of the confident mogul replaced by the terrified face of a cornered child. "Wire fraud, elder fraud. This is insane. I love my father. He's right here." He gestured wildly in my direction, his voice cracking. David's gaze remained locked on Julian. "We have traced the $5.5 million wire transfer from the fraudulent sale of your father's property." He stated each word a hammer blow. "A sale that was executed using a forged signature on documents signed while Mr. Elias Vance was unconscious and undergoing life-saving heart surgery." The full, ugly truth was now laid bare for everyone to see. The room was a tableau of shocked faces and open mouths. The business associates, the wealthy friends, they all took a half-step back, as if the Vance's failure was a contagious disease. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the silent room. First on Brenda, who began to weep uncontrollably. Then on Julian, who simply stood there, his head bowed, the fight completely drained out of him. As the detectives began to lead them toward the open door, past their horrified guests, the entire party turned as one. Every pair of eyes, more than 100 of them, swung away from the spectacle of my son's ruin and settled on me. They stared at the frail old man in the ill-fitting suit, the guest of honor, the inspiration. They were looking for an answer. They were looking for a reaction. Was I a victim? Was I a fool? I gave them nothing. I didn't smile. I didn't weep. I simply stood my ground, my expression calm, my hands resting lightly on my cane. I watched my son and his wife being led away from their stolen castle, and in the profound, echoing silence of their downfall. I felt not joy, not sadness, not even anger. I felt only the quiet, somber satisfaction of a long and complicated equation finally being solved. The books were now balanced, as the detectives led Julian and Brenda out into the flashing blue and red lights that now painted the serene Beverly Hills street. A chaotic murmur erupted in the room. The party was over. Guests began to grab their coats and purses, whispering furiously, their eyes darting towards me with a new kind of fearful respect. They were fleeing, abandoning the sinking ship. But one man was not leaving. Through the scattering crowd, a large red-faced man was storming towards me. It was Mr. Harrison, the man who thought he now owned my home. His face was a mask of pure rage and confusion. "Vance!" he boomed, his voice silencing the remaining whispers. "What in God's name is the meaning of this? I have a signed deed for your house. I paid $5.5 million for it. Your son is being arrested for fraud involving my property." He stood before me, puffing out his chest, a bull ready to charge. He clearly thought I was the weak link, the senile old man he could intimidate into fixing this mess. Before I could utter a single word, Alicia stepped forward from where she had been standing quietly at my side. She moved with a fluid, confident grace that instantly put her between me and him. She was no longer a niece. She was a legal shield. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice cool and even completely unfazed by his blustering. "My name is Alicia Reed. I am counsel for the Vance Family Trust. I believe my office sent you a certified letter regarding this matter last week. I can only assume your own legal team failed to advise you of its contents." She held out a single folded document. It was a copy of the notice she had sent him. Harrison snatched it from her hand. "To be perfectly clear, sir," Alicia continued, her tone dangerously polite. "So, there is no further confusion. You are correct. You did purchase the house from Mr. Julian Vance. The physical structure, that is. Our congratulations on your new acquisition." Harrison stared at her, the anger on his face now mixed with a dawning bewilderment. "However," Alicia said, delivering the final blow, "you did not purchase the land upon which that structure currently sits. That land remains the exclusive property of the trust. The ground lease that made the house's presence on the land legal was irrevocably voided by the fraudulent sale. Your legal team appears to have overlooked that rather critical detail in their due diligence." She gestured to the paper in his hand. "That is a copy of your formal notice. You have 53 days remaining to remove your $1.5 million building from our $4 million property. Good luck with the logistics." The color drained from Mr. Harrison's face. The blustering rage vanished, replaced by the slack-jawed horror of a man watching his entire fortune fall off a cliff. He was a businessman. He understood the numbers instantly. He understood the catastrophic mistake he had made. He had been so blinded by the prize, so confident in his power, that he had failed to look at the fine print. He had been swindled by my son's desperate con and undone by his own arrogance. He stared at the piece of paper in his hand as if it were a venomous snake, a worthless deed to a hollow victory. The final punch had landed. The weeks that followed the party were a blur of legal proceedings, a slow, grinding process that took place in sterile offices and quiet courtrooms far from the drama of that night in Beverly Hills. The fallout was exactly as David and Alicia had predicted, swift, brutal, and absolute. The case the district attorney had against Julian, and Brenda was, in the prosecutor's own words, a fortress. The evidence was not just a smoking gun, it was an entire arsenal. The forged documents, the meticulously traced wire transfers, the sworn testimony from my medical team, and the sheer unmitigated gall of their crime left them with no defense. The charge of financial elder fraud was the one that sealed their fate. In the eyes of the law, their crime wasn't just theft. It was a predatory act against a vulnerable person. It stripped away any possibility of leniency, any chance of portraying it as a simple family dispute over money. A jury would see only a son and his wife robbing their own father and grandfather while he lay near death. Faced with an unwinnable trial and the prospect of decades in prison, they both accepted a plea deal. The last time I saw them, they were pale thin and stripped of all their arrogance, standing before a judge to hear their sentences. Julian was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Brenda, for her role in the conspiracy, received 7. Their Beverly Hills mansion, their cars, their jewelry, everything was seized and liquidated to begin paying back the $5.5 million they had stolen. Their carefully constructed world had vanished. Meanwhile, Mr. Harrison, the man who had been so arrogant and dismissive, was caught in a trap of his own making. He was faced with an impossible choice. He could spend millions of dollars and navigate a logistical nightmare to physically move a massive house off a Malibu cliffside within a 60-day window, or he could cut his catastrophic losses. His lawyers tried to fight, of course. They threatened lawsuits, they postured, they blustered. But Alicia held firm. The law was unequivocally on our side. Finally, humbled and defeated, Harrison's team came to the negotiating table. Alicia, representing the trust, held all the cards. She made him one final non-negotiable offer. The Vance Family Trust would purchase the physical structure of the house from him, allowing him to avoid the cost of demolition and removal. Her offer was $750,000. A fraction of what he had paid, but it was his only way to salvage anything from the wreckage. He was furious, but he was a businessman. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. He accepted the offer. And here was the final, beautiful piece of Clara's posthumous plan. The authorities had recovered the bulk of the stolen funds from Julian's accounts. That money was returned to me as the victim of the crime. So I used $750,000 of the very money Julian had stolen from me to buy back the physical structure of my own home. In the end, the greed and arrogance of my son and his buyer had paid for the restoration of my life. I was made whole again, not through anger or revenge, but through the quiet, methodical application of logic, the law, and the incredible foresight of a woman who had loved me enough to protect me from a future she would never see. 6 months later, I was sitting on my own porch in my own chair, watching the sun dip low over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The house was quiet, filled only with the familiar sounds of the sea and the gentle evening breeze. The faint smell of fresh paint was finally gone, replaced by the comforting scent of salt and old wood. Alicia was sitting with me, a glass of iced tea in her hand, her work done. We sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, simply watching the tide roll in. She was the first to speak, her voice soft, almost carried away by the wind. Aunt Clara was always one step ahead, wasn't she? She said, a note of wonder still in her voice. I looked out at the endless expanse of water, at the horizon, where the sky met the sea. I thought about the chaos, the betrayal, and the cold, methodical path I had to walk to get back to this moment of peace. I thought about my son in a concrete cell and Mr. Harrison in a mess of lawsuits and the beautiful hollow mansion in Beverly Hills being sold off by the bank. She didn't leave us money, I said, my voice calm and clear. Julian thought that's what it was all about, the monetary value of a thing. But Clara knew better. I turned to Alicia, a faint smile on my lips. She left us protection. That's the real legacy. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, salty air. It felt like the first real breath I had taken in a year. In that moment, I realized I had reclaimed more than just a house. I had reclaimed my dignity. I had reclaimed my peace. Justice, I had learned, was not a loud, vengeful thunderclap. It wasn't the thrill of watching my enemies fall. It was a quiet and precise recalibration of the world. It was the simple, profound act of things being put back in their rightful place. The house was mine. The land was safe. The memories were protected. And I was home. The order had been restored. The most profound lesson from this story is that true strength isn't measured in volume or aggression, but in quiet resolve and meticulous planning. Elias's victory was secured not through confrontation, but through the silent gathering of truth built upon the foundation of his wife's incredible foresight. It reveals that those who are underestimated often possess the greatest power. This narrative teaches us that justice is not a loud act of revenge, but the deliberate and precise restoration of order, proving that dignity and intelligence are the ultimate assets that can never be stolen. Let us know in the comments, what do you believe is the most powerful legacy one can leave behind?